October 24th, 1942, 2,347 hours. Lunga Point, Guadalcanal. The sound you need to understand first is not the gunfire. It's the metallic whisper of a belt-fed ammunition system, the specific chick-chick-chick of 30 to 06 Springfield rounds sliding through the feed tray of an M1919A4 Browning machine gun. In the absolute darkness of the South Pacific night, that sound is the difference between living and dying. Sergeant John Basilone's fingers move across the belt. Not looking, just feeling. Each cartridge seated correctly. Each link intact. 250 rounds in this belt. He has 17 more belts stacked in ammo cans behind him, each one packed at the Lake City Arsenal in Missouri by women whose names he will never know. The fabric belt is still dry. It won't stay that way. The gun itself weighs 31 pounds. Without the tripod, without the water in the cooling jacket, without the 4,000 rounds of ammunition he's already distributed between his two guns. Basilone can smell the cosmoline preservative grease, mixing with the thick, rotting vegetation stench of the jungle 25 yards in front of him. That jungle is moving. Not wind. Not animals. 3,000 men. The Japanese 2nd Sendai Division has been walking through that jungle for 6 days. No resupply. No air cover. Each soldier carrying maybe 300 rounds in his pack, 1 day of rice, and the absolute certainty that Henderson Field, the airstrip behind Basilone's position, must be taken tonight. Because if it isn't taken tonight, if American planes keep flying from that strip, the war in the Pacific is over. They know this. Basilone knows this. What he doesn't know, what he cannot know, as he makes one final adjustment to his gun's headspace, setting the gap between bolt face and barrel to exactly 6 inches, is that the outcome of this night was actually decided 14 months ago. Not here, not on this island, in a planning room in Washington, D.C., in a steel mill in Gary, Indiana, in a copper mine in Montana, in the decision to build not dozens but thousands of cargo ships, in the choice to measure ammunition production not in millions of rounds but in billions. But what none of them knew, not Basilone, not the Japanese officers studying maps by candlelight, not even the generals in their distant headquarters, was that this battle, this desperate night fight, wasn't really about courage at all. It was about mathematics, and the math had already been done. Let's talk about what ammunition production actually meant in 1942. The Lake City Arsenal, just one facility, outside Kansas City, Missouri, produced 3.8 million rounds of 30 to 06 ammunition every single day, not per week, not per month, per day. The machinery ran in 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. The workers were mostly women farm girls from Kansas, housewives from Missouri, teenagers who'd never seen a factory before Pearl Harbor, each one operating a machine that could stamp out a cartridge case every 1.2 seconds. By the end of 1942, American factories produced 10.6 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. Billion, with a B. Japan, that same year, produced approximately 600 million rounds total for their entire military, across all theaters: China, Southeast Asia, the Pacific. That's 1/17 of American production. But it's worse than that, because those numbers hide the real story. Japan didn't have enough copper for cartridge cases, copper for bullet jackets. So they collected temple bells. They stripped copper wire from civilian buildings. They mixed in zinc, iron, anything that might work. The resulting cartridges were inconsistent. Some fired, some didn't. Some jammed in the weapons chamber. Japanese armorers learned to test-fire random samples from each batch because they couldn't trust their own ammunition. Meanwhile, in America, copper was so abundant that it became a storage problem. The nation had to build new warehouses just to hold the surplus cartridge cases. But ammunition is meaningless if you can't deliver it. And this is where the real divergence happens. The Japanese supply system to Guadalcanal was called the Tokyo Express Destroyer, runs under cover of darkness. Fast ships racing down the slot, throwing drums of supplies overboard near the beach, then racing back before dawn. The Japanese soldiers would swim out sometimes half a mile to retrieve drums that may or may not have reached the shore, may or may not have stayed waterproof. A single destroyer run could deliver maybe 15 tons of supplies. Maybe. The American supply system was different. The USS President Jackson, just one of hundreds of American cargo ships, carried 3,000 tons of ammunition in a single voyage. One ship, one trip. 200 times what a Japanese destroyer could deliver. And America was building these ships faster than they could name them. The Liberty Ship program. One complete 10,000-ton cargo vessel every 18 days. Welded, not riveted. Built by workers who'd been housewives and farmers 6 months earlier. By late 1942, America had more cargo capacity crossing the Pacific every week than Japan had transported to Guadalcanal in the entire campaign. So when we return to Sergeant Basilone on his perimeter, we need to understand what's actually behind him. Not just the airstrip, not just the other Marines. Behind him, 8,000 miles away, is an industrial base producing more war material in a single month than Japan could produce in a year. Behind him is a logistics system that considered 5,000 rounds per soldier to be normal, standard, expected. The Japanese soldiers moving through that jungle had been told to make every bullet count, to aim carefully, to conserve. Many of them had less than 200 rounds remaining, some had fewer than 100. Basilone had access to somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 rounds within 100 yards of his position. This wasn't a battle. It was a mathematical proof, an equation where one side brought abundance and the other brought scarcity, and both sides were about to discover which variable mattered more. The jungle in front of Basilone's guns began to move in earnest, rustling, whispers in Japanese, the sound of 3,000 men trying to move quietly through underbrush. And then the math became real. The M1919, a 4 Browning machine gun, fires between 400 and 600 rounds per minute, depending on how you time the trigger. Basilone kept his at around 450 long enough bursts to be effective, short enough to manage the barrel heat. At that rate, a 250-round belt lasts approximately 33 seconds. 33 seconds of continuous fire. Then you need a new belt. The first belt went into the gun at 2,351 hours. Basilone saw movement at 25 yards, shadows separating from shadows. He pressed the butterfly trigger. The gun shook. Tracer rounds every 5th round, loaded with phosphorus, drew red lines into the darkness. He could see the tracers hitting, see bodies falling, see more shapes behind them. 33 seconds. Belt empty. His assistant gunner, Private Nash, already had the next belt ready. Feed tray open. New belt in. Feed tray closed. Charging handle pulled. 4 seconds. The gun was firing again. This is what the training was for. The endless repetition at Camp Pendleton. Load, fire, reload. The muscle memory that turns conscious thought into reflex. Because in darkness, with the enemy 15 yards away, you don't have time to think. You have time to execute a drill you've done 10,000 times. But here's what the training didn't prepare him for. The heat. After 200 rounds, the barrel of an M1919 reaches approximately 500 degrees Fahrenheit. After 400 rounds, you can see it glowing in the dark, a dull red that turns cherry red if you keep firing. The water jacket helps, but water boils at 212 degrees. The water in Basilone's gun was boiling, steam venting from the overflow tube. The barrel had to be changed. Barrel change drill. Unlock the barrel retaining latch. Pull the boiling hot barrel out of the receiver. Drop it. Install the spare barrel. Lock. Resume firing. The manual says this takes 6 seconds. Basilone did it in the dark, with Japanese soldiers close enough to hear them breathing, with his hands already blistered from the previous barrel change. He wrapped his hands in his uniform shirt. The fabric started smoking immediately. The barrel came out. The new barrel went in. The gun was firing again. 5 belts gone. That's 1,250 rounds in less than 3 minutes. In the Japanese lines, if you could call them lines, more like a mass of men compressed by jungle terrain into a killing corridor, Private Yamamoto was discovering what American firepower actually meant. He'd fought in China, Mukden, Nanking. He'd seen Chinese troops run out of ammunition after 20 minutes of fighting, sometimes after 10 minutes. This was normal. This was how war worked. You attacked. The enemy fired until their ammunition was exhausted. Then you overran them. But the Americans weren't stopping. Yamamoto had 47 rounds left in his Arisaka rifle. He'd started the day with 120. The rest had been fired over the past 6 days at American planes, at suspected positions, at sounds in the jungle. 47 rounds. He was rationing them. 5 rounds for this attack. Maybe 10 if it was desperate. He had to save some for tomorrow. For the day after. The American machine gun in front of him had been firing for 7 minutes straight. 7 minutes. That was impossible. That gun had fired more rounds than his entire platoon had remaining, and it wasn't slowing down. It wasn't stopping to conserve ammunition. It was just continuous. Like a river. Like something with no bottom. The man next to him, Lance Corporal Sato, was hit. Then the man next to Sato. The bodies were creating a wall. Men were crawling over the bodies. More men were falling. The gun kept firing. And then Yamamoto understood something that changed how he saw the war. The Americans weren't trying to kill every Japanese soldier with precision fire. They were creating a wall of bullets. A physical barrier made of lead moving at 2,800 feet per second. It didn't matter if individual bullets missed. There were so many bullets that the air itself became lethal. He tried to move forward. The man in front of him collapsed. He tried to move right. The gun traversed smooth, mechanical, unhurried. He went to ground, pressed his face into the mud. The sound of bullets hitting trees, hitting dirt, hitting men was continuous, unending. This was the moment. The precise psychological instant when courage becomes irrelevant. Because courage is the will to face danger. But you can't face a wall. You can't courage your way through 10,000 bullets. Math defeats will. Yamamoto began crawling backward. Captain Yoshimura, 300 yards behind the main assault, was having a different revelation. He was an experienced officer, promoted through the ranks in China, where Japanese forces had swept through numerically superior Chinese armies with ease. The secret had been simple. Japanese soldiers were better trained, better disciplined, and most importantly better supplied than their opponents. But Guadalcanal had inverted the equation. His men were starving. They were sick. They were down to handfuls of ammunition. And the Americans were firing like they had factories behind them. Because they did. Yoshimura could hear it now. Not just Basilone's gun. Multiple machine guns. Mortars starting to fire. The Americans were calling in their own artillery on positions barely 50 yards from their own lines. They could afford to. They had so many shells that danger-close fire missions were just acceptable losses. Acceptable. Because they could replace everything. The shells, the guns, even the men, if necessary. Yoshimura realized, we're not fighting an army. We're fighting an economy. And economies don't get tired. They don't run out. They don't break. They just produce. By 0130 hours, Basilone had fired an estimated 8,000 rounds. His assistant gunner was dead. 2 other Marines had crawled forward under fire to bring more ammunition. The pile of empty ammunition cans behind his position was waist-high. The ground was covered in spent brass, thousands of cartridge cases glinting in the muzzle flash. The Japanese attacks were becoming disorganized, less coordinated, men running forward in small groups rather than waves. Then, individuals. Then, nothing. By 0400 hours, it was over. Dawn on October 25th, 1942, revealed something that no amount of training, no warrior tradition, no samurai spirit could prepare the surviving Japanese soldiers for. The bodies were stacked 3 deep in places, but that wasn't what broke them. Soldiers understand death. Soldiers can process casualties. What they couldn't process was the brass. The spent cartridge cases around Basilone's position formed a golden carpet, knee-deep in places. thousands upon thousands of empty shells catching the early morning light. One Japanese officer, a lieutenant who survived and wrote about it years later, described standing at the edge of this brass field and trying to count, trying to comprehend. He estimated 15,000 casings, maybe 20,000, from just 2 guns. In one night, his entire company had landed on Guadalcanal with 38,000 rounds total, for 180 men. That was considered adequate supply for a 2-week operation. One American Marine, in one defensive position, had expended nearly half that amount in 10 hours. The mathematics of it created a psychological break that no amount of courage could bridge. This wasn't about being outfought. This was about being out-resourced on a scale that made fighting itself seem pointless. A Japanese NCO named Sergeant Takahashi later wrote in his diary, "We were told the Americans were soft, that they loved comfort and would break when faced with determined attack. But what I saw on Guadalcanal wasn't softness. It was something worse. It was abundance. They fought with the casualness of men who knew that every bullet they fired would be replaced, that every meal they ate would be followed by another, that every piece of equipment they lost would simply appear again. We were fighting men who treated war like a job, who showed up with toolboxes full of infinite ammunition. This is the true defeat, not physical, but conceptual. The Japanese military doctrine was built on spirit overcoming material disadvantage, the warrior's will defeating the enemy's resources. It had worked in China, it had worked in Malaya, it had worked in the Philippines, but those enemies had been resource-poor themselves. China was barely industrialized. The British in Malaya were at the end of a supply line that stretched around Africa. The Americans in the Philippines had been isolated, cut off, stranding. On Guadalcanal, the Americans weren't isolated. They weren't cut off. Every week, more supply ships arrived, more ammunition, more food, more everything. And the horrifying realization, the one that spread through the Japanese ranks like a disease, was that Guadalcanal wasn't special. This wasn't the Americans scraping together resources for one crucial battle. This was just normal, standard, how they fought everywhere. Captain Yoshimura, watching his survivors stumble back into the jungle at dawn, did the math. The 2nd Sendai Division had landed on Guadalcanal with approximately 2 million rounds of rifle and machine gun ammunition for 12,000 men. That was the result of months of logistical planning, of carefully rationed supplies, of prioritizing this operation above others. Basilone alone had fired 0.75% of that entire divisional allocation. In a single night, at a single position. If the Americans could do that everywhere, and clearly they could, then the math wasn't just unfavorable, it was impossible. You can ask soldiers to be brave, you can ask them to die, you can ask them to charge machine guns and throw themselves at fortified positions, but you cannot ask them to believe in a lie. And the lie was this, that spirit conquers material. That will defeats wealth. That courage is enough. It isn't. It never was. The war didn't end on Guadalcanal, but it was decided there. Not by John Basilone's courage, though that was real and extraordinary. It was decided by the industrial capacity that put 15,000 rounds within his reach, by the logistics system that delivered those rounds across 8,000 miles of ocean, by the economy that could produce that ammunition as an afterthought, a rounding error in the monthly production figures. The Japanese soldiers who survived that night and made it back to their lines carried with them a knowledge more destructive than any bullet, that they were fighting an enemy who could simply afford to win, who had so much material abundance that individual heroism became irrelevant, swallowed by statistics. And once you understand that, once you truly internalize that you're not fighting soldiers but fighting production capacity, courage becomes a kind of suicide, brave, perhaps, honorable, maybe, but ultimately meaningless. The math had spoken. And math doesn't care about honor. John Basilone received the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. He deserved it. Every piece of it. The citation reads, "For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action against enemy Japanese forces, above and beyond the call of duty." It's all true. But here's the truth that doesn't fit on a medal citation. Behind Basilone, invisible but absolutely present, were 18 million American workers in war production facilities. Behind him were the 2,710 Liberty ships that would be built by war's end. Behind him was a railroad system moving 97% of war materials across a continent. Behind him were the copper mines in Montana, the steel mills in Pennsylvania, the rubber plantations the Allies had seized in Southeast Asia, the oil fields in Texas pumping 1.5 million barrels per day. Behind him was an economy with a GDP of $1,350 billion, fighting an economy with a GDP of $200 billion. The outcome wasn't in doubt. It was in the spreadsheets. Japan made one crucial miscalculation at Pearl Harbor. They assumed that destroying ships would demoralize America, that a sharp shock would bring negotiation. What they failed to understand was that America didn't just have ships, it had shipyards. It didn't just have planes, it had assembly lines that could produce planes faster than Japan could train pilots. The Battle of Guadalcanal, Basilone's desperate stand, the piles of brass casings glinting in the tropical sun, these weren't aberrations. This was American warfare at standard operating capacity, not maximum effort, not emergency production, just normal. By 1943, America was producing so much material that the problem shifted from scarcity to distribution. Not, do we have enough? But where do we put it all? They built floating refrigerated warehouses, ice cream barges, mobile bakeries that could produce 10,000 loaves daily. The military complained about too much cargo clogging the ports. Meanwhile, Japanese soldiers were eating their shoe leather, literally, boiling it for the trace proteins. This is the lesson that war teaches, but that we constantly forget. In industrial conflict, heroes are products of systems. Courage is meaningless without logistics. Will cannot defeat wealth. John Basilone didn't hold Henderson Field because he was braver than the Japanese soldiers who attacked him. Some of them were probably braver, more willing to die, more committed to their cause. It didn't matter. He held Henderson Field because behind him, 8,000 miles behind him, across an ocean, in states he'd never visited, in factories he'd never seen, millions of people he would never meet were making the bullets he fired that night. Because America had decided that winning the war was a production problem, not a courage problem. And America was very, very good at production. The Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and made it home carried many scars. But the deepest one wasn't from bullets. It was from the realization, the bone-deep understanding that they'd been fighting an enemy who treated war like an industry, who had so many resources that waste was acceptable, expected, calculated into the planning. When the sun rose on October 25th, 1942, what lay scattered in front of Basilone's position wasn't just brass and blood and bodies. It was proof, mathematical, undeniable, brutal proof of a truth that decides wars. In modern industrial conflict, courage only matters if you have enough bullets to be courageous with. The Japanese had courage. They had discipline. They had warrior spirit. Basilone had logistics. And in the end, logistics won. It always does.